Muy buenos días con todos. Mi nombre es Sidney Novoa, soy director de Sistemas de Información Geográfica y Tecnologías para la Conservación en Conservación Amazónica. Y esta mañana quiero darles la bienvenida a lo que es nuestra sesión de resultados y clausura de nuestro Observatorio de Biodiversidad en los Andes Tropicales. Antes de dar inicio a esta mañana, quiero empezar agradeciendo a los miembros del consorcio de este observatorio que durante estos días de taller nos han apoyado y sin ellos no hubiera sido posible la colaboración de todos los especialistas en esta región. A nombre de nuestra directora ejecutiva, María Elena Gutiérrez, quiero saludar y agradecer a este consorcio que hizo posible el proyecto TAO. Su apoyo institucional ha sido invaluable. Tenemos representantes por 7 países, entre ellos está ASEA, ¿no? Nuestros colegas de Bolivia, Navío, Ecociencia de Ecuador, NatureServe, el GeoBOM, el IDIP, la Universidad de Córdoba, y el gran apoyo de la ERANET LAC a través del Fondesit, ¿no? También queremos expresar nuestros agradecimientos especiales a Miguel Fernández, Mike Gill y Leticia Navarro, quienes desde el GeoBOM han sido fundamentales para el desarrollo de las actividades de este proyecto. En la primera fase hemos identificado a los usuarios y generadores de información sobre biodiversidad en los países andinos tropicales de Bolivia, Ecuador y Perú.
These countries such as Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. Later, they identified key areas with urgent needs for users. This project, well, there was a first pilot globally that is testing how the concept of essential biodiversity variables can be used in order to directly respond to information urgencies in our countries, and which also has the potential of being replicated in other countries around the world. We also thank experts who were with us during these sessions, our plenary sessions, and at the start of the workshops, such as Dr. Francisco Jose Alvarez from the Ministry of the Environment, Lily Rodriguez Bayona from CIMA Cordillera Sul, Robert Langstrud from the Inter-American Development Bank, Lynn Reyes, Mario Napavid, Federico Durand, Malena Martinez, Yasmin Caballero, Carlos Zambrano Torello, Carlos Ugarte, Scott Lorate, Ulyanov Sulka, Mike Jill, Carissa Becerra, Thomas Balki, Elsa Rengifo, Daniel Herrera, Carmen Josa, among others, from the different organizations that I've mentioned. So we have around 120 specialists among generators of biodiversity data and users of the same who have gathered together in order to design this observatory, which will allow to operate on biodiversity data, which will set a pathway for the next steps in establishing an international network for observation in our region. Before starting our presentation, we'd like to introduce our presenters for today. I would like to give some instructions for all of our audience here this morning. You may send us your questions via the different platforms. For those of you following us from Zoom, you may do so from the Q&A option. And for those of us following this from Facebook Live or YouTube, you may submit them via, well, directly to the email comunicaciones@conservacionamazonica.org, where we'll have a selection. Well, we will pick a selection of these questions due to time constraints. We will not be able to answer them all. So I would like to start now with the presentation from our presenters. I would like to invite Dr. Maria Cecilia Londoño so that she may activate her camera. Thank you so much, Maria Cecilia. Dr. Maria Cecilia is a biologist from the Los Andes University in Colombia with a master's PhD in the Nacional Autónoma University, Mexico. Her experience is in geographical analysis of biodiversity for decision making, and she's participated in identifying priority areas for conservation and territorial ordinance planning in Colombia. She's also worked with government institutions such as the Department of Institutional Planning or private institutions as International Conservation and academia in the Javierana University. She's currently a main researcher in the monitoring and evaluation from the Humboldt Institute in biodiversity issues, and she hopes that from this position she may use data and academic knowledge in order to support management of biological resources. Please, doctor, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much to all the organizers of this event, and especially Miguel for this invitation to perform this talk today. First, I would like to congratulate you for such a cool project that you've been developing and sharing. I've received comments from colleagues about the positive presentations and topics that have been developed throughout these days. So I would just like to tell you that there is there's communication with other countries in Latin America, not necessarily just these three, and this is all very interesting. So I'm now going to share my screen. Are you looking at my screen properly? That's great. So today I bring you reflection from the Joban presidency, but also regarding the experience we've had in Latin America under this network. I would like for you to, when you hear this presentation, for you to see how the Tropical Andes Observatory effort is really well articulated with what we want to achieve in Geoban and for the following years, and just for you to be able to see how important these observatories are and these regional bonds and national bonds that are being built or set up. Now going back here, observations on biodiversity, closing gaps in order to reach sustainable territories, or to achieve sustainable territories. So there's knowledge from everyone that there are certain gaps on data and knowledge. The gaps are factual or taxonomical. There are very well are demonstrated groups, others are not. Geographical gaps, some sites with much information, others with very little. So this is very well known by everyone, right? And these gaps in knowledge and data take us to knowledge gaps, which are very significant. I like to pinpoint here the importance of moving toward areas of knowledge in the workings of ecosystems where, well, we know much now or much more about our species, their distribution, but on how they are working with regards to ecological networks and how their processes are happening, for instance, to have a resilient ecosystem, that's where we're lagging behind. So we need much more information in order to reach those needs or get to those needs. And even more so, I would like to tell you that when one starts looking at who has the information and the knowledge and who's generating that knowledge, well, we're seeing this world that is even further split. We who live in uh, developing countries, we are much more aware of those gaps, perhaps. But I would just like for you to know that under the GeoBond network, we are seriously thinking on how to close these gaps, these great differences between those who have the information and can use it in their decision-making processes and who can understand the dynamics of their ecosystems more easily and defending their conservation versus other countries where this limitation and the knowledge on these and this data is very limited. And this, of course, makes it so that sustainability issues, this gap between the North and South, developing and developed countries, is even wider. So we want to move further in closing that gap, and obviously the project is a great example of how there's investment and effort carried out in closing those gaps. So of course, this relates to all interested parties in solving a problem on biodiversity, and independently on whether this is a global issue or an international stakeholder or a local community. It should have the capability and the right to be able to know their own biodiversity and following these data flows in finding partners in order to work on obtaining information, having monitoring schemas, analyzing data, having indicators on what's going on in their territories, and relating those indicators with change drivers and performing the corresponding scenarios on what may be happening and going towards solutions based on that information. Now, these are the workflows that I know that you know pretty well. You have worked on generating these essential biodiversity variables. So these networks actually need to go on multiple levels. This also needs to be scalable from local to global, and we need to have this interoperability and articulation among the different networks at the different levels. So, of course, thinking about this information and its purpose, there needs to be something further beyond than just having these indicators or these reports or briefs ready. There needs to be something that moves us to use this information and moving from what to do toward how to do it on a guide on that. Well, we need to conserve biodiversity, but how will we go about it? So that's information that we need to generate and obviously build onto that complex issue that we have to solve for. And this is the issue of making territory sustainable. So in these networks, we need to get people involved, the different stakeholders, and we need to seek those common goals. Now we need to think about sustainability processes for these bonds and monitoring systems. So the more linked they are to solving the problem, the more sustainable they will be in time. The more applicability they have, the more appropriation they have on the different stakeholders, they will be more sustainable in time. So Juban is also thinking about working on this practical community. It's not only an issue of scientists with scientists. I know that you know it pretty well. It's an issue of users with all who produce information, with those living in the territories that are most affected. And so this is an effort under these knowledge networks and practice communities that we have been developing. And I'll set two examples of things done inside Dubon. And if you think of the TAO example, that is clearly one more of these medium scale examples. And we have all post 2020 goals where Dubon builds informative documentation. It supports the parties in their decisions and opinions. And if you note, well, this is a chart of documentation that is delivered so that countries may defend their their points. And so this is all the flow from primary data, how it is employed in order to produce those essential variables, and those variables, how they feed into indicators that are giving a report on advancement toward those global targets that these countries are discussing. And here I bring you a local example in a dry forest in Colombia. And it's the same issue. There's problematics, there are scenarios that are that people in these territories see in their future. There are some goals that they want to reach, some actions, some questions that are intriguing from the territories. And here we have some variables again. Once more, we have variables coming up, these EBVs as an element that helps them to respond to these questions and looking into how they can start advancing and obtaining these sustainable or achieving these sustainable territories. So GeoBot is also working on this, and they build guides or guidebooks, manuals, and working also in implementation of these monitoring systems and going together with them in time. So these are two examples, very different scales, but as we can see, by understanding the complex problem and integrating the issue of EBBs for monitoring advancement toward goals that give a solution to these complex issues. And to start wrapping up, so I bring you this reflection from Joban. Of course, if we want for data and observation networks to really be have an influence in decisions in reaching or achieving those sustainable territories, well, information needs and priorities, we need to identify them as a participative process which supports the different stakeholders on this data, and so that it's much easier to use them or apply them in achieving those ideal visions on their territories. And obviously, solutions must be provided so that stakeholders have the tools in order to achieve their goals. And I leave you with two questions that I know probably, well, under the TAO project, there are many answers that can help us, but we have two questions on how integrating and improving evaluation and monitoring systems of environmental and social conditions in order to provide a better guidance toward efforts in navigating towards sustainability, and how can observation systems on biodiversity be better integrated into adaptive management systems and learning systems in society. So we need to be better with the networks that we are building. And so this is a concern from the network, and the network's effort has been quite large in conceptualizing essential variables, building the workflows for them, and we're looking into the momentum that this has globally. And now we need to move toward that second step on how this is a solution or makes a part of this solution for the issue that we currently have in the world with biodiversity conservation. Thank you so much. And I'm open to questions.
Muchas gracias, doctora María Londoño.
Thank you so much, Dr. Londoño. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the presentation rounds this morning. Again, just to let you know, people who are looking at this broadcast live via our different channels, that you may submit these questions, be it for the Q&A session for those on the Zoom platform, or also to the comunicaciones at conservacionamazonica.org for those of you following from Facebook Live as well as on YouTube. Now, I would like to give way to Dr. Tim Hirsch so that he may also turn on his camera. Dr. Hirsch is Joint Director and Chief of Participation and Commitment from the World Fund of Information on Biodiversity, better known to us as GBIF. Dr. Hirsch has had a professional journey which is not quite conventional. He went through journalism, 20 years, going through consultancy and scientific communications toward leadership, international advocacy on information exchange on biodiversity, and as joint director and chief of participation and commitment to the GBIF, Tim directs the network that supports national nodes and topics from GBIF that share data for research and policy on biodiversity. And he also manages programs for improving capacity, collaborates with networks throughout the world and communicates activities from GBIF. Tim worked as scientific writer on CDB in authority of reports from the third, fourth, and fifth perspective on biodiversity. Dr. Tim, thank you so much for being here. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Sydney, and it's wonderful to be joining this workshop, and thanks in particular for providing interpretation for this webinar, which is extremely helpful. So I'm going to share my screen, which I hope you can see now. You can see my presentation. I'm going to provide some reflections about GBIF itself as a network, but also then thinking about some of the important interconnections and ways of working together that we feel are critical, looking at the GeoBond network in general, and of course your observatory in particular, and the way that then can intersect with GBIF, both as our global network, but also through our national nodes and participants. Just a quick comment on that title slide. You can see there the pictures I've put there are simply a random selection of the amazing bank of images from your region, from the 3 observatory countries that are shared alongside the records through GBIF, just to give a little bit of a small flavor of the wonderful biodiversity of the region. First of all, just a very quick introduction to what GBIF is. I think some are more familiar than others with it. We are an intergovernmental network established in 2001, dedicated to to facilitating access to biodiversity data of all types from anywhere on Earth, based on the principle of free and open access. And we work through a network of nodes, as we describe them, participant nodes that coordinate activity at a national level, and we have a secretariat based in Copenhagen. On the right, you can see the homepage of gbif.org, which gives a bit of a summary of the scale of data that we deal with. So, for example, we now are serving nearly 1.7 billion species occurrence records coming to us from over 120 countries and a total of more than 1,600 institutions who share their data. In terms of our formal network, so the governments and international organizations that are that take part through the governance of GBIF, you will see from the map there that in terms of South America, we have reasonably good coverage, but certainly not universal. So of the 3 countries in your region, we have nodes, we have participants in Peru and Ecuador, not yet in Bolivia, and of course we'd very much like to bring Bolivia into our global network. But that gives an idea of how we are represented in formal terms in South America. This is just a view of, if you like, the main activities, the main function that GBIF helps to play by bringing together data from very different types of evidence, and through the use of common standards, enabling that data to be integrated and discovered for further use, both in research and onward into policy. So just quickly going around that semicircle on the left, that data comes from digitized specimens in natural history collections. It comes from observations of many different types, both structured, organized surveys, but also citizen science, data from environmental impact assessments, for example, data coming through from literature, from tracking of animals, and increasingly data coming together from exploration of DNA in the environment, or environmental DNA. And the key to bringing that all together is that through a global community agreeing to use common standards, we are able to integrate that and index it so it can easily be retrieved through searches and then downloaded or accessed via our API to use in models and research and onward into policy. And you can see on the right there, that's a map showing the relative distribution of just the number of observations and specimen records that we have. And you can see there are some parts of the world where we have much greater and others that where we have much less concentration of record. And that goes to the issue of filling gaps that Maria Cecilia referred to. In terms of the value, if you like, that we can recognize of the use of GBIF in research and then onward into policy, it covers, as you would expect, particularly areas, themes around conservation, protected areas, threatened species, invasive species, etc. But it also we can see the use of this data across other areas of sustainable development, notably around food security, for example, in data relating to crop wild relatives, many aspects of climate change, modeling the projected changes in species ranges based on, for example, species distribution models, and very topically, of course, use in human health and disease, using biodiversity data relating to the distribution of species that are vectors, hosts, and reservoir of human diseases. And then we also see the way in which the data that's served through GBIF feeds into, for example, the indicators for progress towards the targets of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And you can see on the screen on the left there just some of the particular indicators in which data accessed through GBIF plays a role. And several of those are indeed indicators that have been developed through GeoBon. I'm just going to give a little bit of a look of what data currently flows into GBIF from your region. So what I've done here is simply done a filter of our occurrence records simply for the three observatory countries of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And you can see on the map there, that's simply a representation of where they occur. And it's so that it's a little bit small on the screen there, but this is over 11 million individual records with coordinates that are already flowing through GBIF. And on the right, you can see at the top the taxonomic distribution, and as many of you will probably not be surprised to see, the great majority of those records are vertebrates and in particular birds, with a fair portion of flowering plants, and much lower representation from other taxonomic groups. One type of data set that I wanted to just highlight in this context, and this is an example of data that is coming through a data set published by the Ministry of Environment in Ecuador, is that as well as simply representing each individual occurrence as a species occurrence records, through the standards used in the GBIF community, it is possible to group those records around what we describe as sampling events, or the event core. And what that enables is, if you look at the left screenshot, that shows the overall summary of that data set. So it's a data set showing data from vegetation plots in Ecuador. And that is divided into a little over 400 separate events. So in other words, within all of those records, and there's 19,000 records there with coordinates, taxonomic descriptions, etc. That's divided into each individual plot census. And so on the right, what you can see is just an example of one of those events, one of those particular inventories with a description of the methodology over there in the top right. And then on the far right, you can see then within that plot, there is an articulation of the different species that were found in that particular sample. And I raise this just to show that through the integration and the standardization process of putting data into GBIF, it's not just lots and lots of dots on the map you end up with, but within GBIF, the data that are accessible through GBIF, there is also the opportunity to express the diversity of species found in particular samples in a particular time and a particular place. I put together a representation here of the kind of connections that we would see as being really important in combining the work of GeoBon and GBIF and of course observatories within the GeoBon framework, such as TAO. And just looking at that in summary, I've described it as working together to mobilize, manage, and measure. So taking it from the left, GBIF, of course, through our own network of institutions sharing data and our nodes, is mobilizing that data, as I described, from many different sources. But of course, that's a critical role as well of GeoBon and your observatory to bring together standardized observations. Then moving to the right in terms of the managing part, GBIF, through its infrastructure, is able, through the use of common standards, to make sense of, if you like, and integrate the many different types of data that is shared using common formats, and to make it available through indexing and integration and the means of access, to then take on to further interpretation, critically, for example, through essential biodiversity variables that can then be used to generate indicators for the CBD and, for example, for IPBES. And I would just then draw attention to the two feedback loops at the bottom and the top there that I've shown there, where on the one hand, through the work on defining EBVs, essential biodiversity variables, GeoBon and your observatory is able then to design and to help incentivize the creation of observation networks that can be part of that mobilization process. And then the other feedback I've put at the top, and this goes again back to the gap filling aspect, is that, for example, working through IPBES, but indeed through other organizations, we can take knowledge gaps to help to feed back to the mobilization process by prioritizing the generation of new data. So I hope this gives an idea. This isn't an official view, it's very generalized, but I hope it gives an idea of how it's really important for GBIF and GeoBon to work together, both at the global level, but also at the national and indeed the subnational level, to make sure that all of the potential partners are collaborating and not working separately in order to create these virtual flows. I'll just finish with two more slides. One is to emphasize that in terms of the training and the capacity building that GBIF works on to generate data, we are increasingly working also with partners and through capacity programs to help in capacity to use that data in decision making. And one of my colleagues who is in fact joining us as a participant in this webinar, Andrew Rodriguez, has worked particularly on that to develop course materials on data use for decision making. And I think it'll be very good to see how we can collaborate further through GeoBon to develop some of those materials jointly. And then just finally, this is literally breaking news. This is a news item which has just gone up on the GBIF website today, to note that as from now, the data that flows through GBIF is being exported regularly as snapshots into the Microsoft Azure cloud environment as part of their planetary computer program. And this then, so that we are now, GBIF is now one of the data sets, the public data sets that's available for use on the cloud for computation using the Microsoft infrastructure. And this is part of an initiative that GBIF is committed to ensure that the data is available in formats which is most convenient and uses the lowest technical threshold to be able to use for onward analysis. And we have, in fact, also just got our data onto the Amazon Web Services, and we hope that Google won't be far behind. So that's just a little bit of news that hopefully will provide an extra tool to be able to do data analysis using the GBIF infrastructure. So I'll finish there and just say thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Hirsch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hirsch. Your presentation, highly interesting, and in fact, to all of us who are in natural sciences and biological sciences, we have on some occasion gone through querying GBIF information, and we've been witness to this great evolution that has been demonstrated during your presentation as well, toward how currently today all of this data can be used freely via many platforms for free resources or open resources. So again, I would like to highlight or, well, repeat for people who are following us via networks that you may send us your questions via the appropriate channels. We will have a round of Q&A at the end, where we'll invite our presenters to answer these questions. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Roger Saire, so that he may also turn on his camera. Dr. Roger Saire is a senior researcher from the Geological Service of the United States. He is a geographer of ecosystems and leads activities from the Earth Observation Ecosystem Observation Group in order to build standardized maps that are robust and practical for land environments and also freshwater and marine environments as well. He works with Esri scientists and international experts for developing maps of high spatial resolution, first of their class, on world ecosystems. These maps are built to be used in setting conservation priorities and accountability of ecosystems, among other applications. Dr. Saire publishes regularly scientific papers on indexed publications, and he's author of many chapters on the matter in question. Before working in the Geological Service, he also worked in conservation and cartography for World Biodiversity in the Natural Conservancy NGO for 3 years, and currently he participates in many initiatives and on informatics and flagship programs from GeoBon. Dr. Saire, welcome, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, se ve y me escuchan. I hope so. Okay, great.
Yes, señor.
Okay, si me permite abrir con pocas palabras en español, básicamente.
If you allow me to open with a few words in Spanish, basically, just like to say hello and saying thank you for the opportunity for sharing with you some remarks on ecosystems.
Fue un placer
It's been a pleasure seeing and listening all experts in the first day of this workshop.
Muy informativo, muy interesante.
Really informative and interesting. And I'm going to continue working along those lines, focusing on ecosystems.
Just trying to advance. maybe I'll stop share and try that again. Okay. I'm going to talk about ecosystems today, and the very first slide that I was going to prepare, I was planning to title that TAO, Tropical Andes Observatory, and GEO, the Group on Earth Observations. And somehow it just came out as TAO and Chi. And so I decided to just go with the metaphysical for a little bit, TAO, the order of the universe, and Chi, the energy of the universe. But in the context of the Tropical Andes Observatory, I thought, well, the TAO of TAO is biodiversity, genes, species, and ecosystems. And then the Chi of TAO is really our collective energy and will and spirit to conserve that biodiversity. Bueno, bien metafísico, pero a mí me gusta.
Not very metaphysical, but I
And
like
now
it.
we have heard so much about GeoBon, and we're hearing about the Tropical Andes Observatory as a regional bond. And I found this tweet from Enrique, a group of people, and there you see Enrique and Miguel and Leticia and some others having a discussion about a larger Ameribond. And that is a concept that I really support. That's a great idea. And I've been working in Geo for years and years now. And one thing we always talk about is seeking what we call cross-geo fertilization, because there's just so much going on across Geo. And it turns out that just as there are regional bonds, there are also regional geos. And there is a regional geo for the Americas, and it's called AmeriGeo. It's strong. It works with all the countries. It has 4 what we call thematic pillars: biodiversity and ecosystems, disasters, agriculture, and water. And working in that biodiversity and ecosystems sustainability pillar, I can just assure you that there's a lot of potential for and interest in a collaboration with the Tropical Andes Observatory. Queremos colaborar con ustedes.
We would like to collaborate with you.
And then similarly, there's another initiative, a strong initiative in Geo called Geo Mountains, and it's all things mountains. And among other things, we are contemplating within Geo Mountains this notion of essential biodiversities and essential biodiversity variables, EBVs, and especially those EBVs that are relevant in a mountain context. And so from within Geo Mountains, again, I see that there's potential for and interest in a collaboration with you all in the Tropical Andes Observatory. Queremos colaborar con ustedes.
We want to collaborate with you.
And so now I'm going to move on and discuss mountains associated with TAO and ecosystems associated with TAO, and even some of those are mountain ecosystems, sort of the geography of TAO, if you will. Starting with mountains, do we know exactly where the Tropical Andes Mountains are? I would argue that yes, we do. There are actually 3 global mountain extent characterizations. I call those K1, K2, and K3 because the last name of the first author on each of the papers describing those efforts began with K. And so I wrote all about these different characterizations in that paper that you see there. And there in that box on the right, those are the tropical Andes mountains proper, according to the K1 definition. These are the tropical Andes mountains proper, according to K2. And these are the tropical Andes mountains, according to K3. And they probably looked kind of similar to you. And in some cases, they are nuanced. And in other cases, there are some pretty considerable differences. But I think the point here is that we have really well mapped the mountains of the tropical Andes region, if that's of interest and potentially useful for you. Switching a little bit now to ecosystems, I am the lead for a Geo Ecosystems global ecosystem mapping task. And that task is to develop a standardized, robust, and practical global ecosystem classification and map for all the 3 domains, terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. And last year, we put out a new global world terrestrial ecosystems product. You see the map of those ecosystems in the lower right. There were 431 of them at the what we call the globally aggregated level, but if you disaggregate by biogeographic realm, and you all are in the neotropical realm, then the number of global ecosystems is 1778. And we put a paper out on that in the journal Global Ecology and Conservation. I encourage you to read the paper and download the data because I think they'll be useful for you. Continuing on that line, in terms of the ecosystems of the Americas, I really feel that there are sort of 2 options in terms of good mapped information on the distribution of ecosystems in the Americas. On the left is that the USGS Esri Nature Conservancy World Terrestrial Ecosystems that I was just mentioning. On the right are the NatureServe Terrestrial Ecosystems of the Americas, a really great resource and probably the one that you are using on a daily basis in your work there. That NatureServe Americas terrestrial ecosystem product differs from the World Terrestrial Ecosystem product in that NatureServe ecosystems are very sort of vegetation emphasizing, and they sort of are built as aggregations of different vegetation types at different hierarchical levels. Again, really great, rich work. And just a shout out and a saludo here to Carmen Jos and Pat Comer from NatureServe, who I've worked with a lot in the past. And congratulations for that work. But I also think that you might want to, again, have a look at this new World Terrestrial Ecosystem resource. It's global, but they are at a 250 meter spatial resolution. That's pretty good for a global product. And just to give you some familiarity with what these things are, I want to take you on a quick tour, a transect, if you will, from Western Amazon, sorry, from the eastern part of Ecuador to the western part of Ecuador. And so this first ecosystem that you see here is a tropical moist forest on plains. That's the nomenclature here. We start with the landform, we start with the climate, and then the vegetation type, and then on what type of landform does it occur. Tropical moist forest on plains, Pura Amazonica. And then moving westward, that same vegetation assemblage, tropical moist forest, but now going up a little bit on hills. Still going up and now getting a little bit colder. We'll find subtropical moist forest on mountains. And now very high and very cold polar moist grasslands on mountains. I think you might call these punas if I remember my Spanish. We also see cool, temperate, dry shrubland on mountains. Subtropical moist forest on mountains now on the western slope. We have that on the eastern slope as well. Tropical moist croplands on plains. And yes, we do have two sort of converted classes, at least from a natural ecosystem perspective. Croplands and settlements, or the built environment, can be very useful to have those classes as well mixed in. And then here we have a tropical dry shrubland on hills, getting further and further to the west. And then a subtropical dry shrubland on plains. And then lastly, one of our favorites because it's so unique and so highly threatened everywhere it occurs, tropical dry forest on plains. So that's just a quick look to give you some familiarity of what these ecosystems are like. Of course, we could have done that transect through Bolivia or through Ecuador or through any of the tropical Andean countries or through any of the South American countries or any country anywhere in the world for that matter, because it's a global standardized data set. And now just to close with some comments about ecosystem extent as an EBV. I think that the choice of classification system and map really matters when you're going to be calculating ecosystem extent as an EBV. When you have options, and I think you do, and when it's nice to consider different systems because they bring a complementarity, then it's always a great idea to try to develop these crosswalks between these systems. Very useful if you can do it, never easy, never straightforward. Some basic considerations about the type of classification system that you might consider when calculating ecosystem extent. Has the classification system been mapped? That's important. There is an emerging new global ecosystem classification put out by IUCN, the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology. It's extremely rich. It's very well thought out. It's being used as a standard in many different sort of exercises like ecosystem accounting and whatnot. It's great, but if you want to use it for your area, you'll have to map it because right now it's a classification only, that is a list and descriptions. Can it be replicated? We need to see publications that provide the methods so that it could be replicated to the extent possible. Is it practical and universally accessible? Do people get it? Can you name an ecosystem and people understand it? That sort of outreach and making things simple and broadly understandable is extremely important. Can it be replicated temporally? Well, you're really going to need to be able to do this over time because we are not just interested in calculating ecosystem extent at one point in time or as a baseline. We want to know about change in ecosystem extent. That's really the end game for us. And then finally, does it permit comparison between sites? That means, is it standardized such that you can compare sites locally, nationally, regionally, and perhaps even globally? So thank you very much for the opportunity to make these comments about ecosystems, and thanks for your patience with that little metaphysical sidebar that we went on. Muchísimas gracias a ustedes. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Roger.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roger. It's been a pleasure seeing your presentation and much of what you've showed on the resources this morning. On some occasion, I have been able to show them as well as to many of my groups of students in university when I once had to impart classes on these ecosystems globally. Now, I would like to please invite our three presenters this morning, Dr. Maria Cecilia Londoño, Dr. Tim Hirsch, so that they may also turn on their cameras, please, because we're going to give way to a round of Q&A, and it will work as follows. I'll be able to convey to each of you in an orderly fashion the questions that we've been receiving via our channels, and we'll ask you to answer concisely so that in order to allow us to have a second round, as we've exceeded a little bit of the time that we had planned for this morning. I would like to start with Dr. Maria Cecilia Londoño. We have a question, and with so many initiatives in the region working on environment conservation, how may we work in a more coordinated fashion and stop competing among initiatives? Yes, that's a very good question and also very necessary to answer. I believe this relates to having negotiation processes among all parties, but negotiation process is a collaborative effort. So in other words, especially in Latin America, we need to change the mindset of negotiation that I'm going to gain more than the other, but that we're going to collaborate toward common goals. So I believe that is the first entry point that we need to work on in the region, sitting down with others to do those negotiations and have clear what is the intent or the goal of working jointly. That's a second very important aspect. The third is that when these things arrive, we need to have clear governance on that alliance that is being built. Who will make the decisions and how they are made? I believe that if you have the three elements clear and clear goals, a governance system that is also clear, and a model for negotiation and cooperation, you may get to work jointly, which is so necessary and important. Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Londoño. I would like to now give way to a question for Dr. Tim Hirsch. I'm told, how can collaboration happen with GBIF on the information available from private collectors?
Yes, it's a very good question, that, and something that we are actively working on now. We, both as a global network and through many of our national nodes, have been engaging strongly with both individual companies and also sectoral associations to encourage the sharing of data, particularly generated through environmental impact assessment. And increasingly, and I would particularly highlight Colombia actually as a country which is making constant progress in working with private sector partners to ensure that the data, for example, that goes into monitoring associated with environmental impact assessment is not simply discarded or lost at the end of the process, but is shared, in their case, through their national GBIF node, and then onward through into GBIF. And this is something which is attracting more and more interest at the global level, including, for example, through financial institutions. And recently there was a new addition, for example, to the Equator Principles signed up to by many of the world's leading banks, which encourages lenders and development actors to require data sharing as part of the conditions of their finance. And that's already starting to provide a real incentive for the private sector to see their role as part of that broader set of stakeholders helping to contribute to the data commons and therefore to help ultimately in understanding and decision making on biodiversity. So it's something we're very actively involved in. There are a number of initiatives that we'd be glad to share with you in more detail afterwards, but it is very high on our agenda.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Hirsch. Ahora pasamos a una pregunta.
So much, Dr. Hirsch. Now we'll give way to a question for Dr. Roger Saire. Well, first, you're being thanked for offering this open gateway to, well, which is the Geo initiative and all of its programs. You showed AmeriGeo, GeoBon. The question is, what is the immediate channel for collaboration which one must follow in order to start a relationship with the Geo initiative? What would be the suggestion from Dr. Saire?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a good one. There isn't a sort of overall mechanism for anyone to join any of the sort of Geo initiatives or community activities. It's pretty much done on a case-by-case basis, but there is usually an open membership such that anyone who has any interest in any Geo activity can get involved. And so the way to do that is really to contact, I feel the best way to do that is to put yourself in contact with the leaders of those initiatives. And that is why I, for example, included the leaders of AmeriGeo, the chairs of AmeriGeo, and the leaders of the Geo Mountains group. And for example, they specifically would welcome emails, and then they will tell you how they are building their own community of practice and how you can join, and what the sort of range of, what the universe of topics is that particular initiative is contemplating. And they will ask for your contributions, your participation, and they will welcome that. I have found that Geo has been incredibly inclusive over the years. They want to build the community as much as they want to achieve certain specific measurable tasks. So Geo is all about openness and inviting people into these different communities. And so it's just a matter of finding them, finding out the right person and making that initial contact, if that helps.
Claro que sí. Muchas gracias, Dr. Saire.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Saire. Now we'll continue with the second round, and again, we have one for Dr. Maria Londoño. We're being asked, what are the difficulties that are most significant in building these participation systems for an observatory? Well, I believe that the main difficulty is trust, building that trust. Well, it's not a difficulty, but it takes time because, as you know, we want these processes to go fast, and they actually require time so that that trust among different stakeholders can be had. Now, another great difficulty is sustaining these initiatives, pretty much in relation to particular projects, and when the project ends, the interest from people from the groups is diluted and doesn't go further. So how to make it sustainable beyond the duration of a project? I suppose those are the two main difficulties. Now, suppose the level or the participation is different because there are participatory processes with stakeholders from industry, or if you mean participatory process with local communities, there are perhaps different difficulties between one case and the other. Now, going back to local communities, I feel that citizen science, for instance, one of the difficulties in Latin America is to build this awareness on the importance of observations. We don't really have a strong vocation of naturalists as in other countries. So building that culture on the importance of observation and recording, monitoring is something that takes time also to build that awareness. Thank you so much, Dr. Londoño. Now we'll give way to Dr. Tim Hirsch. We have a question that says, how is it that GBIF leads or faces these issues regarding the quality of information and data, specifically on issues of geographical inaccuracies or taxonomical inaccuracies that the information can be uploaded with? Dr. Hirsch?
Yes, so this, of course, it's a constant challenge that when you have a very high volume and, in effect, an open data network, issues of quality are always going to be there, and you will never get to an absolutely perfect solution. There are routines that are carried out in an automated way so that when data is shared through GBIF, there are flags that are attached to data that appears to have problems in a way that we can identify through our own scripts, and those are then relayed back to the user. There is also a feedback process so that if issues are reported, we can then communicate those back to the data publisher, the data provider, in order to correct them. But there are also data cleaning tools that are provided both at the point of generating the data and putting it into GBIF, so that ideally, of course, that cleaning will happen before it arrives in GBIF, but then also data cleaning tools that we will advise users to use in order to be able to, as best as possible, filter the data that they get from GBIF to be fit for their uses. The other, I think, important point to make is that one of the really key principles of GBIF is that all data that you will find within GBIF has full information about the provenance and the detail of where that data comes from, so that it is always transparent for users to be able to look at the individual components of data that they find in GBIF and make their own judgments as to which sources they may find more or less fit for their use. So there is a process of enabling the user to filter or to clean data so that they end up with the data that they've got through GBIF, which they're most comfortable in using. So it's if you like, it's a constant process. You will never get perfection in a system of open sharing of data. But it's certainly always a high priority for GBIF to find the best ways of ensuring that data is as of high quality as possible.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Hirsch. Muy ilustrativo.
So much, Dr. Hirsch, highly elucidating the process on how GBIF can start overcoming these challenges regarding inaccuracies with regards to certain determinations. And now to wrap up this round of Q&A, I would like to tell Dr. Saira that we have one more question that I will try to better word in order to understand it better. Currently, there is this initiative of IUCN regarding the red list of ecosystems So the question goes on how important it is to decide among one or another classification of ecosystems that you have presented us with this morning, and for this kind of initiative, such as the ecosystems red list.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a good question, and it can be a delicate subject. All these classifications and maps have their own strengths and weaknesses. And so sort of the most informed user is really taking a hard look at them all to see what they like and what they don't like, and sort of extracting out of that. It rarely works to have to put all your eggs in one basket and just go with one system, because that system inevitably is not going to be adequate or satisfactory. So I try to cycle around, know as much as I can about all these different systems, and I'm really paying attention. I've been working with the IUCN folks on their new concept, and that one is going to be very powerful because it's both good, and it comes from IUCN, very well respected. So that one is actually being selected as a standard by the United Nations for their system on environmental and economic accounting. And so because every country now will need to do ecosystem accounting, every country will need to report that accounting using the new IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology. And again, it isn't mapped yet. So the assumption is that you would take your map, say the Ecosistemas de Colombia, the famous ETER map, and someone would crosswalk that into the new IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, and then use those units for the calculation of ecosystem extent. I think that's kind of the game going forward, is that we all become as expert as possible in the different flavors of ecosystem mapping for ecosystem extent.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Zaire.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zaire. Well, we finished our morning session. I would like to ask our three presenters this morning to keep your cameras on for a few more seconds, since we'll be taking a class picture for this morning. So on my mark, to our communications colleagues, so they're ready. We're ready. 1, 2, 3, smile. All done. I understand the picture has been taken. Thank you once again for your participation, your time, and especially for showing us from your experiences and perspective on these aspects related to the observatory. We are wrapping up with this first part of our session, and we'll carry on communicating the results of these sessions through our networks. Thank you so much to everyone for being with us.
Ana, por favor, toda la gente que está en la sala de espectadores, ahora que pase a plenaria. Gracias.